The start of this, of course, is not back with the Normans, but here we get into the Plantagenets, and we think about, as we do with, I suppose, the various periods of monarchs, we think now of a very, very long period, because the Plantagenets will go all the way to 1485. And that's a long time, even in the medieval period. It is up to 1485 because, as you know, the beginning of the Tudors. And so, for some reason, they cut it. As we will see, there are some very, very different features, but few are as significant personally as Henry II. Just briefly to repeat to you, in case you have forgotten in the last week, the understanding of Henry I was that despite the Civil War, the throne would go to his favorite Stephen, and his own daughter, Matilda, thanks to the fact she was a woman and thanks to the dislike of her husband, the throne would pass to Matilda's son. And of course, that is the subject of today. Matilda, by the way, is the subject of a very great biography. And even though I'll talk about Eleanor, I think Matilda's a very, very interesting figure. And, like they always say, it should have been herself as queen, but I'm supposing that she and her husband, Geoffrey, were there as the very supportive parents. Now, we know, of course, the fact that Henry II was so much a movie-themed figure. We think about, I guess, we think of all the kings who've been in movies, Richard the Lionhearted, and nowadays, with all these television movies, I call them. Yeah. I mean, you talk about the Tudors. Well, I won't go into all of that, but just in this particular period of the 60s, it was interesting to me that there were two major movies about Henry II. I think a lot of that has to do with the interest in the two people around him who had so much of an influence on him, and he certainly on them. And that, of course, being not Richard Burton, but Thomas Becket. And as you see, it was in living color. I guess we could call it that by then. It was, as you see, in 1964. And Burton was, I think, riding high, and he and his, I guess they were married by this point. And of course, Peter O'Toole was, I think, younger and perhaps less known, because remember, this is before Lawrence of Arabia and all the films that we remember. 1968, yeah. I think this is one of those based on a play. This particular film, 4 years later, which definitely shows he's aged. I think he probably had more cocktails than he needed. But the idea is that Katharine Hepburn, and I think this was the year after Spencer Tracy died, but this is not a Hollywood class. So I promise you I'll control myself. But it's interesting that these two famous actors were there together in what was a story that I remember leaving and thinking, God, they were dirty back then. And I need to get over that. This is not a time for those who love Irish Spring and Lifebuoy, because I mean, it's like, it's just not part of their lifestyle. But there was, remember the scenes in the castle? I mean, it just seemed like a lot of filth to me, but that's okay. We do appreciate the fact that this was based on a famous play. I actually saw the play on Broadway. Very interesting to think about how many ways you can get the movie, buy the t-shirt. I mean, everything about the Lion and Winter. I mean, and so many productions ever since. But again, it's because of Henry II and these two people who were, shall we say, near and dear to him. At one time or another. I don't want to say it was permanent. And we're talking, of course, of Becket and Eleanor. I mean, true love never seems to last. Now, as Frank told us, we do enjoy sheep. And Mary had a little lamb, lest we forget. But seriously, the idea of the 12th century and the fact that this is truly a social and economic time for England, because this course gets so political and religious, we forget that most folks are like they are today. They got to make a living. And the idea is population is growing, and much of that growth will be based on Flanders. That is to say that at this point, the English will grow the sheep, and that wool will go to across the water and into Flanders or modern day Belgium, northern France, where, in the sense that they would use it back then, a basis of economic prosperity for both sides, and also the beginnings of some manufacturing creation in terms of a major commodity. Now, this, of course, takes a long time to develop. All we want to get is the idea of London, which then, as later, is a major center of banking and industry. The Italians will come in and help develop this and make it very, very large indeed. And again, I say that because for so much of the period, we think of this as being essentially too far west, but we know that in fact it becomes, during this period, especially during the 12th century, a very, very important area. Now, a word about the Cistercians. We all know about Benedictines, I suspect, poverty, chastity, and obedience, and so forth. But now we have to mention the Cistercians. You say, but they're not English. No, but we've got to move on out of France and go west. The Cistercians are a monastic order, and they think, not surprisingly, oh, you know how people say today, well, they're not following their roots. They are getting too modern. They're getting too fancy. The Cistercians in the 12th century, or even back to the late 11th, are saying, we're not going to do anything fancy. We just plain folks. Well, I mean, they're not Southern Cistercians, but you get the idea that they want to get back to the roots of St. Benedict. no fancy houses. We're going to work. We're not going to stay in the library all the time. Well, that isn't exactly the way it happened, but they had the idea of we will work, we will do things, and they did. And they came to Northern England. And I mean, you might be down the road, there might be some fancy schmancy Benedictine house. And they're sitting around chanting and reading and making manuscripts. And you know what we're doing? Working in the fields. You say, but they didn't have to. No, they didn't have to, because most of them came from very elite backgrounds. You know, if you're going to be a peasant, well, you're not going to be a peasant. You have to be a peasant, right? But I mean, you don't say, gosh, I'm a peasant, I think I'll live in poverty. No, that comes, I mean, that's required, okay? So, I mean, you don't hear about any well-to-do peasants. So these folks are from the best families, often very well educated. And the fact is, they become very much involved in the advancement of agriculture, especially in sheep farming and shearing and all the rest. And the Cistercians then, I thought, were very important in connection with the growth in the 12th century of the sheep business. Now you say, how can we be simple and so forth if we are Cistercians? Well, the theory is that we will take all our profits and use it for the development of more Cistercian houses and so forth. Yes and no, but you understand the dream of monastic poverty and monastic hardship and rigor is a very hard one to maintain. Now, here is the map, and you'll notice the idea is, of course, and many of you know where we're going now. Eventually, we are going to go west because we'll be very interested, of course, in this whole area, see Cardigan Way and going over in this particular area. Bristol Channel. And down south, of course, is the area we already hold. This particular area, of course, is going to be Ireland, and we are aware of how significant that is going to be, even as we will move into Wales. And all of this is to understand that Henry II is not going to rule over this territory so much as he's going to want it, because it's there. Scotland, of course, is a separate kingdom, but Wales is there tempting him, and that will go on as independent somewhat until the 14th century. It's interesting to be aware, and you don't, when you go to Oxford and Cambridge, you don't have to listen too much to the little people who give the tours, because a lot of that is just, you know, tourist talk. I mean, it's nice, but what we see is largely Victorian, as you know, and has nothing to do with the medieval period. I wish I could do a lecture on medieval universities, but suffice it to say that Oxford and Cambridge are among the very first institutions of higher learning, but beautiful colleges like Christ Church and all the rest are definitely not products of this period. They simply were developed many, many centuries later. However, they were great centers of education. And of course, their curricula was what we would consider today, I guess, impractical. As many students would say to me, my mama and daddy want to know why I have to take history. I mean, yeah, I know. But I don't think that had that problem in the Middle Ages. I think that was what they were there for. If they had wanted to farm or play in test tubes of things, I think that was not as big a problem. But you say Plato and Aristotle, yes, yeah, we're very concerned with things. As long as we have the Christian overcoat. Now, John of Salisbury, Robert Grosseteste are known for what they consider to be science. We consider it, of course, thanks to modern science and the necessity of proof, a little bit non-convincing because, of course, we want some evidence for our assertions, and it can't be logic, which they thought was just the ultimate. But all of this is to say that the 12th century was a very exciting time for people, well, France too, Normandy, and all of the areas in Paris and and northern Italy. But this is not the place to pursue that. We just want to know about Henry and his family. And remember, Geoffrey and Matilda were the lucky parents. And if we had had, I guess, them talking to family counselors or wondering about how did he turn out the way he did, well, I refer to him as energetic and mercurial. I'm just reading a book about Winston Churchill in 1940-41. I mean, he seemed to be pretty mercurial to me. That is the idea. You have to see how he is that day. I mean, sometimes he can lose it. Someday he can be pleasant. So, yeah, you just don't want to cross folks like that, because it's not like he's always going to be a ray of sunshine, because he gets in, well, like Mercury, he will be sometimes unpleasant. But bright, educated, and they talk about he would have been the most educated of the rulers up to that point, which is an interesting, again, business to note in terms of the 12th century. And I'm not talking about just poli-sci 101. I mean, he had studied the classics, and I mean, think about Alexander the Great and other great, Julius Caesar. I think Henry II is definitely someone, the Angevin court, the Norman court, and now the English court, all of this would have made him very, very well prepared to be a statesman, because remember when Stephen, the king preceding him, during his last years, despite the fact that Stephen had a son who didn't live, I think it was understood that Henry, one way or the other, was going to have an important role once Matilda gave up her own aspirations and passed him on to her son. So I think he was well prepared, as one could be, for that particular business. And he married when he was fairly young. In fact, he was younger than his wife. I won't call her infamous, the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine. It'd be interesting to have Eleanor and Matilda in conversation and wonder how they would have cared for each other. But obviously, thanks to her fame, I guess there is no medieval queen that we know more about than we know about her. Eleanor of Aquitaine was twice married, as you know, and she was from what we consider the south of France today. She became the Queen of France because of her father and the French monarch and his advisors, who said, since a woman is going to be the heir to Aquitaine, you better jump on it and let them be married. The marriage of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine was supposed to be the perfect solution for the issues concerning France, because, as many of you know, having gone down there, it's huge, prosperous. It was an important part of the Roman Empire way back when, well developed, and sadly for him, that is to say, Louis VII, it was not a successful union. It's odd, really, that that makes such a difference, but I suppose it has to do with Eleanor's own will. They were married, they had 2 daughters, and thanks to, I would call it religious piety, they decided to go with the Holy Roman Emperor to the Holy Land on crusade. This is the not so famous Second Crusade. So, you know, when you get together with people and they want to talk crusades with you, okay, you can stop that whole business if you wish to and say, maybe we can talk about the Second Crusade. Conversation stopper. They won't know this, and you will. You'll feel superior. And not that you aren't already, but I'm just saying. It's amazing how few people know about the Second Crusade, you know, about the third and the fourth. But the second, not so much. In any event, why was Eleanor Aquitaine on crusade? I thought that was a men's thing. That's interesting, isn't it? Because if there was another noble woman who ran around like that, or as we would say in an earlier time, gallivanting, I'm not aware of that. I mean, there were, you know, women who followed soldiers, but the idea here is that she was going as his partner, and they went. And of course, the Second Crusade was not a success. And it appears that by the time they returned, they were ready to part. Which is interesting. How do you get out of these things? Well, when they're negotiated, I think it has to do with the papacy considering degrees of consanguinity. If you find a tree, get your tree and see if there's someone related way back when, and you can give gratuities to the right people. whatever the case, I suspect it had to do with the fact that Louis VII had not yet a male heir, rather than the idea that you've heard the old thing about Eleanor saying, I thought I'd married a man, but I married a monk. I find that very doubtful. I think more likely it's the fact she not produced a male. Well, she's ready to, but it's not going to be with Louis, as you know. Once the marriage ended, she was now available, and she was out on what's it they say, on the net? I mean, on the web. You go out, your dating app. I don't all of that kind of business, because that didn't last long, because Henry, and I saw a reference to him not long ago, Henry of Anjou. I'd never heard that, but I guess that's as good as anything. Henry, who was Bachelor King of England, and he just said, I think I love you, like the old song, you're wonderful, you're beautiful, I can't do without you, all of that. And off she went. So she was not, what would you say, between marriages for very long. And you can just imagine how Louis felt. You can't be happy. You say, well, I'm sorry it didn't work out for us, but I remember all the wonderful times we had. No, but I don't think he's worried about her heart, or nothing harlequin here. This is all about Henry getting his hands on Aquitaine. Because remember, Henry already has other lands in France. Yes, I mean, we're thinking Normandy, Anjou, just get titillated just to name them. I mean, it's like, and now this. I mean, and remember, territory is money. I mean, it's all about the way that some of our rich friends would think about, oh, I got this, I got that, all of that. Greed, the filth of, yeah, thank you. Yes, you got that. So, speaking of that, we have what the textbooks always call the Angevin Empire. I know. But since all the textbooks do it, I'll do it too. It's not really an empire, but I think it's one of those terms that it sort of makes sense in the context of the Angevin family. Although they don't really show us all of England, do they? And of course, there's Wales, and that Wales is just waiting to be part of this territory. I think they can afford to wait a while, because we all know about the relationship of Wales and England, which can be somewhat turbulent. But we see how much of all this territory, from his mother, from his father, from his wife, because the rules are, and this helps us understand why women, if something happened to the husband, many of them wanted to go without the husbands, because the minute the husband comes in, he says, oh, I'll take that. I mean, honeymoon, forget it. I want the land. I mean, it's all, you see that, but you see all of these lands. And of course, ultimately, we realize that you hold these lands not as one, but each separately. And the result of that is going to be the fact you'll be duke here, you'll be count there, you'll be king the next place. So and in none of these places you're going to be emperor. So it's just all of this he holds. And of course, he will have to deal with the queen's former husband, Louis VII. They're both kings, so it's got to be relatively small group of people. And technically, he is vassal for Gascony. You see Gascony way down there, part of Aquitaine. Beautiful wine country, very beautiful. But all of that is territory that he will now hold and technically be vassal to the King of France for. But when he goes across the channel, he's king and he has no lord except the one above. That is, of course, the theory we're working on here. Now, again, it's nice to inherit. We get that. But inheriting can sometimes be problematic because there are so many dues that we pay. For example, in the Angevin area, because the nobility of Anjou don't necessarily like the nobility of Normandy. You say, but they're neighbors. Maybe that has something to do with it. I mean, I'm sure Wadleians love the Opalicans. I'm sure of that. And yet that sense of ecumenical love is not always shared, is it? So there we have a question of bringing these people, and they're always referred to as turbulent. So we have mercurial, so let's have turbulent now, because that's what they do. They fight, and I guess that's part of it. But technically, he is their, have to be careful now, he's not their king, he's their lord. And it's very, very important that they understand that, even though they understand it more in theory than they do in reality, because they do like to fight and misbehave. And to a certain extent, Henry's part of that. Now it's time to turn to, about to say, Burton. But we won't turn to him. We'll turn instead to the character he portrayed in 1964, Thomas Becket, who has surely got to be one of the most interesting, bizarre figures that we study in history. Now, he's a saint. So you say, is there a reason for that? Well, I guess it's because of the church's decision. But whether we think that that was necessarily the right decision, I will leave to each of us to decide. As far as Becket is concerned, and if you haven't seen the film recently, you might have forgotten that there were some very prominent individuals who wanted to be the head of the English church. And they were not friends of Becket. According to most sources, Becket, far from being a holy man, was very ambitious, and some might even say worldly up to a point. Worldly in the sense like Well, I think I'll work on my sheep shearing this afternoon. I don't think so. He came from, believe it or not, a Norman merchant family. So I think they were probably prosperous. They had brought him up to be in the church. It was not like, church, are you serious? I mean, it was a good career path if you were a younger son. So he was, and he was obviously very bright. You'll notice that, and notice the name of where Theobald was, Beck, as in Anselm, as in Lanfranc. Beck just churned him out. I mean, it's kind of like Harvard and Yale and Supreme Court. I mean, it's like when you think, I wonder where they went to school or where they were trained. Beck. So Theobald Beck had become archbishop. You see the dates. And that had been a very stormy period. And he seemed to get along with the kings. I'm not saying he was a total sycophant, but he did okay. You notice he's not Saint Theobald, just saying. And I'm not saying he's necessarily worldly, but he was more of a stand-patter. And when he died, Henry II had become king, and many would say, boy, he barely made it, because Henry II being king, things were going to change. I mean, I'm not saying he and Stephen were all over each other, but they got along okay. And when papal people came to see Theobald, I'm not sure they always got the answers they wanted from Rome. But as we always say, London's a lot closer than Rome is, right? So he knew how to deal with the kings, but Henry II had some different ideas. As I say, he had more or less trained Becket. And Becket, who had become archdeacon, which is as you may be familiar yourself, Marnie, is a kind of administrative post. It's as far as Canterbury is concerned, while your archbishop's running around confirming people and ordaining people and having lots and lots of ecclesiastical responsibilities, the archdeacon is doing all the paperwork and shifting people to different parishes, all of that, because there's a lot of that going on. So archdeacons are, I'm not saying they're bad. A lot of people got to be pencil pushers, right? Administrator. And that is what Becket was for him. And more or less, that's where he and Thomas Becket and the king got together, by his being archdeacon. And Theobald sort of promoted him to the king. And we're talking very early. Believe it or not, they had not known each other. You think this is a relationship that they just became, what do we say now, best buddies or whatever you have. I'm not necessarily convinced that he violated the vows of chastity as seemed to be indicated in the 1964 film. But I am willing to say that I think he was probably very worldly. I mean, maybe they would go out and have social drinking. And the king liked him and he liked the king, and Theobald more or less pushed him. So, despite the fact there were some bishops who had a larger CV or, for the position, when Theobald died, Henry thought, gosh, now that old man is gone, my best bud can be Archbishop. And that makes you very excited when you're someone like Henry, because what it means is that he'll do just what I want because he loves me. That's what love is all about, saying, yes, sir, you're the boss. And we all know that may have been the source of what will follow, because I'm not thinking this is the way it was supposed to be. But I know I couldn't bear not to get in one more picture, because the personal friendship, the becoming royal chancellor, all set up basically Archdeacon of Canterbury, and then the final step when Theobald died. And whether or not we like to think that he pushed Henry II that way or Henry II did it all on his own, it happened. That is to say, a few years into Henry's reign, he appointed him and Becket as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And believe you me, there were some disappointed bishops. You can imagine it's sort of like, no, we're just happy for him. We're so pleased. You know how to do after a pageant, and then we say, yeah, I know it. Like, I just congeniality. It's like the Bishop of London, I was supposed to be the leader and say, but isn't that sinful to? Yeah, but they get over the sin, and they let's just say I don't think Becket had a chance in terms of like, but let's see how he'll work out, because I think they kind of knew how it was going to be, because he suddenly became very, very defensive about the rights of the church. You'll notice I say ostensible resistance. As far as we know from the sources, Becket would say, gosh, gee whiz, I don't feel comfortable with this, that kind of thing. Oh, shucks. There's so many outstanding people in the church, and I look up to them so much. Again, I don't know how much is reality and how much is just utter hypocrisy, but whatever the case, he came in as Archbishop of Canterbury, but the days of Lanfranc are over. And do we want to call him another Anselm? I don't know, because Becket pushed matters even further than popes wanted him to, because all of this business of the church's rights and church's privileges had advanced even since Lanfranc's time and Anselm's time. The idea of, you see that term, criminus clerks, or clerks as we say. The idea here is, remember Lanfranc created this canon law code, a code of separate laws for clergy. So if you have your clerical ID card and you get caught let me think of someplace wild. Like maybe in
Stealing sheep.
yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean somewhere like downtown Auburn. The mean streets, College Street. And you're thinking like, and then you get, oh, what is it they say? Wasted. Then maybe if the cops come, I can say, but I'm a clergyman. You have to turn me over to clerical authorities. I'm sure they would be very impressed if I pull that one. Or if I would go to right across the street from Tiger Town, and yes, and they would be rude and hurt my wrists. And they do that in the movies too. Yeah, that would really hurt. So I'm going to behave. But that is the idea that you can't hold a clergyman by lay authority. And I guess a lot of people were in the ranks of the clerics that weren't necessarily have a divine calling. Can I put it that way? They might have dated or might have had gone to happy hour or whatever it is. And you think this is just not right. Well, a living is a living. I mean, some people are not as well called for the priesthood as others. But the issue was strong. And I mean, if you get in trouble in these lay cohorts, it can get right rough. Those facilities for the lay folks are really not good. And if you are in a clerical cohort, they'll say, you know what we're going to do to you? We're going to lay aside you. And you say, oh, no. Yes. We're going to take away your priestly position. Oh, shucks. Really? Yeah. I mean, that could be a hit on your pocketbook. Yeah, no. But you can, I guess, go out and party or like being in Dadeville. Other wild places. I know, Marnie. But the understanding that issue really got his go. That is the mercurial king, if I now can employ that word. Henry II didn't like this because he thought, get over it. You talking to Becket. Remember my best bud? Well, that was last week. Now he's being a little ornery and saying, Your Majesty, you have to respect the rights of the church, but you'll answer to God. And, on and on. And to say that Henry II didn't like this is an understatement, as you can imagine. And all of this will lead to the famous event at Canterbury. And they always pointed it out to you at the tours in the cathedral. And the idea, which of course will be very significant, excuse me, at least until the days of Henry VIII. I don't think he appreciated that for his ancestor to be besmirched that way. But in this particular incident, the statement that supposedly was made by Henry II, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest, or whatever the actual quotation was, would lead these individuals to cross the channel with their duty before them, and they ended up executing him, which is described by the annalists, by the annal writers, I should say, as being a deed that was next to the betrayal of Christ, I would say. So no one understood the implications because, like other societies, this could be a very violent one. But the martyrdom, quote unquote, of Becket is more or less going to be very significant for the church. Now, interestingly, we think the popes of the day wanted Becket to sort of, I don't want to say cool it, but at least be more moderate and not push Henry too much because they were making progress. And it's very, very odd to think that at this particular point, that relationship was being completely disrupted because Becket was not willing to compromise, make a deal. So I think it's fair to say that Becket was on his own in many ways, and many of the bishops were sort of glad and thought this would bring him down. But his martyrdom was an international sensation. He was quickly canonized, and the church preferred him dead than alive because now he could be considered as serving the church, and Henry was now expected to do atonement. I know. So this is an illustration of doing penance. For those who remember the film, you remember you had to go through the thing of they had their little flagellation devices, and yeah, I know. And that would not have been pleasant. Whether or not the king was sincere, I seriously doubt it. It's just something you go through. I mean, like military school. You know about those poor boys. I mean, that's just something you do. You have to have demerits, and then you serve your time. But deep inside, you don't feel bad. But that's what he did. And what, in terms of his own authority, is not significant at all, because his authority, that is royal authority over the church, will remain. And to prove that, I have an interesting quotation from a work by a man named Jocelyn of a chronicle from the 12th century during Henry's reign. Jocelyn of Brakeland, his name was. And he is an amazing observer of all the little foibles of life in the monastery. Bury St. Edmunds was wealthy, powerful, large. And this monk was watching what was going on. And in this case, Jocelyn tells about the abbot of the monastery and when he dies, and how the various monks will fight over his possessions. And you say, well, that's greedy. That's very naughty. You shouldn't do that if you're a monk. Well, I mean, people do it, let's face it. I mean, like last will and testament. Yeah. You know, all you have to do is go to law school, find out about all this stuff. But you just think, it's odd to think, though, the election of a new abbot And how do you go it? You get with the caucus, and that's why I didn't run for office. And, how you doing? I really like for you to, well, you know, your leaders, you know about that. I mean, but those of us, we listen, support you. And in this case, Samson, not the Delilah boy, but this particular guy named Samson, he was elected, and it's very interesting when it speaks about the king, and we know which king, Henry II. So who doesn't get it? Well, the individual we call Pride, who is number 2. And you know, the Pride wanted it. You say, really? Yeah. But once these monks, who probably were worked, you know how campaigns are. So Samson, he was quiet, but what does the king do? Well, the king just happens to come in to bury St. Edmunds and says, you have presented to me Samson, I know him not. In other words, I don't know. But if you had presented the prior to me, I would have accepted him, for I've seen and known him. But I will only do what you will. Now, take heed to yourselves. Does that sound warm and loving?
Yeah.
I don't know. By the true eyes of God, if you do ill, you're going to get it. Well, he didn't say it exactly that way. I will exact a recompense at your word, at your hands. Then he asked the prior if he assented in the choice. Well, what is he going to say? No, I want it. I want it. No, you got to say, no, it's wonderful. I think it's great. He did will it. And Samson was worthy of much greater honor. Yeah, right. Don't you think? Maybe a little insincere. Yeah. But again, that's miscongeniality. You know, when you have to say, oh, thank you. I'm just glad to be number 5. Yeah, I mean, that's what they do. And therefore he was elected and fell at the king's feet. Oh, yes. Podiatrist, yes. Fell at the king's feet and embraced them. Therefore he was elected, and let's see, rose quickly, hastened to the altar, head erect, without changing his expression, chanting, have mercy upon me, O God. And you say, oh, that is just beautiful. I'm being a little cynical, I'll admit it. But you're thinking just going through the motions? Yeah. And when the king saw this, he said to them who stood by the eyes of God, yeah, they love these expressions. So, by the eyes of God, this elect thinks he's worthy to rule. What I'm getting at, folks, is that the king maintained his power. It's sort of like you can elect whom you want, but they better not push it too far, because I'm the king. God and I, we're in a serious relationship. And so you suck up to me. You know where the Pope is? Not anywhere you're going. Yeah. So you just do what I say. So it's very interesting, I think, in terms of the effects of Becket. I mean, it's a fascinating story. It's worth a movie, several plays, all the rest. But we also know that it does not change the reality of the king's power. Now we can understand why Henry VIII had a big poster of Henry II up there. You know, when I'm changing into my royal duds, I can look and say, I love you, granddaddy. You know, that kind of thing, because this is what Henry the II had made possible for Henry VIII. I'm not saying that they were the same, because they were not, but I am saying that vision of having authority, which eluded Henry II and would be obtained up to a point, but Henry VIII is always there. Now, most of us, even without going to law school, are aware of Henry II's contribution to the court and legal systems of medieval England. As his grandfather had maintained the erratic appearance of justices in the air, that is, royal justices traveling around on occasion, he now decided to regularize it and make it possible that royal justices would appear at regularly scheduled places, particularly for the purposes of monasteries and great lords. Because remember, all of this involves what we so lovingly call today court calls. I hope we're not familiar with that, but I know it from the movies, right? My DVDs, they tell me about that. Obviously, royal courts, for the purposes of laity, will be superior. As far as the clergy are concerned, only when they are in conflict with the laity over what is always a favorite if we want to go to court, which I don't, land disputes. Yes, we all understand that. Big old yawn to me, but very, very significant. And believe you me, the monasteries love to hold on to their land. They'll even fight against bishops if it's necessary. And many times these are not cases for a church court. They will have to be for royal authorities to determine. So they can be very important. All of this, of course, involves what we and what was once called the empire, with the Commonwealth, will be based on the common law, that is, the precedent of decisions made by judges before, precedent, and the result of the common law will, of course, create the Anglo-American legal system in brief. Of course, it's never that simple. We can only think about the centuries in the making and the complexities of it. And just to understand that he is the one who starts it, initiates it, regularizes, I shouldn't say start, but makes it work better, and taking authority away in some ways from the local barons who would have preferred to settle these matters in their own courts because of their authority and the opportunity of financial gain, dare I say it. Now, one thing here, the size of Clarendon in 1166 will become the ancestor of the grand jury. The sheriff, you remember he was the main official in the shire. So he will summon 12 men, and these individuals were supposed to be upright citizens. Yeah. and they were supposed to report to him on people who might be probable. And then the sheriff could investigate them. Again, those of you who served on a grand jury will understand it may be a bit different than that now, but you understand the significance of this concept because it is based on the shire and determining who has a reputation that is somewhat seedy. And someone said, well, I heard he runs around. Maybe we need to check him. So everybody does this, and how this might lead to a grand jury is very clear. In other words, if you're indicted, you're still presumably innocent. But we may have ways of helping you remember. Because we know all the stories. Sometimes they'll say, I can't recall. Yeah. Well, let's help you remember. How about the ordeal? That will help your memory. Yeah. The ordeals, seriously, were really uncomfortable because you could be the ordeal by fire, the ordeal by water. All of these could be memory joggers. Okay. You could remember, oh yeah, I was there that night. Yeah. All of this is to say seriously, at least according to sources I've read, that people could be persuaded by a priest to admit wrongdoing before the ordeal because, what is it they always say? This will go easier on you. Like, yeah, right. So, whatever the case, the ordeals last until 1215, which is a long time, but the ordeals, which are Germanic in nature, were not necessarily going to be significant for Henry II because they went on, but the Assize of Clarendon at least is something of a beginning. Now, I think it's very interesting we get to the mortal ancestor. It's going to be a process of finding out who has physical or legal possession of property, who holds the property at the time of the death of the supposed occupants. And then after that, when they decide that, who is currently occupying it and saying, this is the court now, saying they have possession of it by virtue of living there at the time. But who has title to it? Yes, we all know about titles. Title to it. And guess how that's going to be decided? By combat. And you say, is that really rational? No. And say, well, I'm not going to go fight anybody. But guess what I could do, though? I could tip somebody. Yeah, to get them to do it for me, because I'm not going. So I'll watch and wish them all the luck. But yeah, I'll give them a nice gratuity. Yeah. But then that's the idea. The trial by combat. But you are allowed to have a representative, an agent to fight for me, and my agent beats your agent. And so, gosh, I think it's your property now. Say, well, that's not fair, but yeah, That's the Germanic system. So, as we wind this up, let's talk about family issues. We would like to think that when he comes after a hard day of fighting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, he'll be welcomed warmly and affectionately by the family. No, not so much. Henry II had a lot of issues. He probably could have used counselors, and I'm not talking about advisors. I'm talking about going on the couch with the pipe guy. Yeah, could have really helped him. Much of this he deserves. He had a number of paramours. Eleanor certainly did her part as far as the production of children. 4 sons and at least 2 daughters, in addition to the 2 daughters by Louis VII. So she did that in addition to all of her other responsibilities. And he had various amours. By the way, if you're ever out around Blenheim, a little out from the Blenheim Palace, you go by, you walk around the grounds, they'll show you a place where one of his friends, special friends, gal, pal, whatever you say, Rosamond was her name, which sounds unusual for medieval times. Rosamond, where she may have stayed, although I felt like that was a little too close to Eleanor, but perhaps we are trying to make this modern. I don't know how was particularly Eleanor after putting up with Henry all those years might have felt. And again, we can't think this is Catherine Hepburn all over again, a 12th century Catherine Hepburn. Whatever the case, Eleanor was involved in various plots with their children and with her ex-husband, Louis VII, who was anxious to do what he could to undermine Henry, given the fact that who has more land in France? That's, of course, Henry II, the Angevin Empire. And, of course, when Louis VII died during Henry's reign, the man that we call Philip Augustus, Philip II, was determined to avenge his father. Not that I think that was primary, because I'll be a little cold here. I'm thinking it was also his own glory. That's why the history community calls him Philip Augustus, Philip who wants to get all of this away, get it for us, for the Capetians, for the French monarchy. So he will essentially make Henry's last years quite unpleasant. And he will do this with the great assistance of the sons, those that he can reach. And again, a lot of us might think of The Lion in Winter, or what you may remember of that, and the plots with the queen, that is Queen Eleanor, and how they were all involved with this Philip II. So it's to say Henry II could have said, gosh, I've done a lot during my years. There've been the ups and downs, but I did it my way, that kind of, I won't sing, don't worry. But the idea of how successful, it must not have seemed that way to him at the very end, particularly when his favorite son the future King John will become a traitor to his father like the others. And with that, I think we'll stop and we'll pick it up with those children and the good and the bad that we'll see next time. Thank you.